The shed door is open on a Monday morning in October of 2013, and Harold Briggs knows before he gets out of his truck that something is wrong. He has been farming the same ground for 31 years, and that equipment shed has been locked every night of those 31 years except one. And that one night was the night he came in late from a neighbor's farm after helping pull a stuck combine out of a wet field and forgot, for the first and only time in 3 decades of habit, to run the padlock through the hasp before he went inside. He knows this because he checked his memory of the previous evening, the moment he saw the door standing open from 200 yards away, going back through the sequence of the night before with the particular precision of a man who understands immediately that the specific detail of whether he locked that door is about to matter in a way it has never mattered before. He did not lock it. He drove in, put the tractor away, went inside. The lock is still hanging on the interior hook where he puts it when he pulls it off the hasp. One night in 31 years. That was all it took. The MF375 is gone. Everything else in the shed is exactly where it belongs. The grain auger is against the south wall. The planter is folded and sitting on its transport wheels in the center bay. The old loader tractor is in the far corner where it always is. The 375 is the only thing missing, and the absence of it in the bay where it has sat for 11 years is so complete and so wrong that Harold stands in the doorway for a full minute before he does anything else, looking at the empty space, the way a man looks at something his brain is still processing as impossible, even though his eyes are telling him clearly that it happened while he was sleeping 20 yards away in his farmhouse. Harold bought the 375 used in 2002 from a farm sale 2 counties over, paid a fair price for a machine in good condition, drove it home on a flatbed, and put it to work the following spring. It is not his primary tractor. It is the machine that makes his primary tractor's operation more efficient, pulling the grain cart during early harvest, running the auger during bin filling, doing the tillage passes on the smaller fields where the larger tractor is more machine than the acreage justifies. Losing it is not a catastrophic equipment loss. It is a serious loss, a financially meaningful loss, and an operationally disruptive one. But it is not the loss that ends the farming operation. It is the loss that makes everything harder and more expensive until it gets replaced. Harold calls the county sheriff's department from inside the shed. The deputy who arrives an hour later photographs the interior, documents the forced entry evidence on the door frame, and collects what physical evidence the gravel floor and the October mud outside can provide, which is not much. There are tire tracks in the soft ground beside the shed, consistent with a heavy trailer, the kind you would use to move a tractor that cannot be driven any distance on public roads without attracting the kind of attention a stolen tractor attracts. The tracks go north to the section line road and then onto pavement, where they disappear into the normal traffic of a rural county road that sees enough farm equipment movement in October that one more set of trailer tracks merges invisibly into the background. The primary serial number plate is gone. The deputy notes this in his report, and Harold confirms it. The plate that should be on the side of the tractor has been removed cleanly with tools, leaving only 4 mounting holes in the sheet metal as evidence it was ever there. The deputy explains, in the careful way of someone delivering information that is both accurate and unwelcome, that removed serial number plates significantly reduce the probability of recovery. Without the plate, the machine needs to be identified by other means, and those other means require specific knowledge and specific circumstances that do not occur reliably enough to produce consistent recoveries in agricultural equipment theft cases. The deputy files the report. The investigation runs for 3 weeks, following leads that go nowhere. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no matches in the regional equipment theft network. The case goes dormant in early 2014. Harold files the insurance claim. The settlement arrives 4 months after the theft, and he uses it to purchase a replacement machine, a different make, because the right Massey Ferguson utility tractor at the right price does not present itself in the window when he has the settlement money available and needs to replace the working capacity the 375 provided. The replacement machine is adequate. It does the work. Harold does not love it the way you sometimes love a machine that has served you well for 11 years. And he does not expect to, because the replacement machine has not yet earned that kind of regard and may never earn it in the way the 375 had earned it through a decade of secondary work that Harold had come to take for granted in the way you take for granted anything that always does what it is supposed to do without requiring your attention. The theft report stays open in the county system, the serial number is in the database, and for 9 years, nothing connects to it. The man who does the engine rebuild is named Curtis Warfield. He is 44 years old, runs a small engine and equipment repair shop out of a converted dairy barn on his property, and has been turning wrenches on agricultural equipment since he was 17 years old, working summers for a farm implement dealer that has since closed. Curtis is not a specialist in any single brand, but he knows Perkins engines the way a man knows something he has worked on continuously for 25 years, which is to say, past the manual and past the specification table, and into the specific sensory knowledge of what a particular engine variant feels like when it is healthy and what it feels like when it is not. He does engine rebuilds as a specialty within his broader repair business, taking in machines from farmers and dealers and other repair shops in a 3-county area who need that specific level of work done correctly and who have learned over the years that Curtis does it correctly. The tractor arrives at Curtis's shop in the spring of 2023, delivered on a trailer by a farmer named Dale Schomer, who bought the machine 18 months earlier at a private sale from a man who was reducing his operation. Dale paid a fair price for what presented as a sound utility tractor with normal wear for its age, received a bill of sale that looked like any other private sale bill of sale, and had been running the machine through a season and a half of normal field work before the engine began showing signs of wear, serious enough to justify a rebuild. The engine burns oil. The compression numbers are low enough across enough cylinders that the local mechanic Dale consulted recommended a full rebuild rather than a top-end service. Dale brings it to Curtis because Curtis is who you bring a tractor to in that part of the county when the engine needs more than a tune-up. Curtis begins the engine teardown the following week. He pulls the head, he pulls the pistons, he pulls the crankshaft. He assesses the bore wear, which confirms the compression numbers Dale's mechanic recorded. The cylinders need sleeving, the standard remediation for this degree of wear on this engine variant, and Curtis has done enough of these to know the procedure without referencing anything beyond his own accumulated experience. He is cleaning the block on a Tuesday afternoon, preparing the casting surfaces for the machine work that will follow, when he finds the stamp. It is on the block casting in a location that is not the primary serial number location, not where a buyer or a thief or a parts counterman would look first when trying to identify a machine. It is a secondary factory identification marking, a practice that Massey Ferguson used during certain production periods on certain engine variants as an internal quality control and assembly tracking measure that was never widely publicized and that does not appear in any owner's documentation or dealer reference material that a normal equipment buyer would have access to. Curtis knows about it because 25 years of Perkins engine rebuilds have put him inside enough blocks to have encountered it before, and because one of the older mechanics at the implement dealer where he learned his trade mentioned it once during a conversation about equipment identification, a piece of institutional knowledge passed from one generation of mechanics to the next, through exactly the kind of informal channel that keeps useful information alive in trades long after the formal documentation has been discontinued or forgotten. The stamp is not dramatic. It is a series of numbers and letters pressed into the casting during manufacture, small enough that you could run your fingers over the block surface and not notice it if you did not know it was there and were not specifically looking for it. Curtis is specifically looking for it, the way he looks for it on every block he rebuilds, not because he expects to find anything significant, but because it is part of how he documents the machines he works on, and documentation is how he protects himself and his customers in a business where the provenance of equipment matters, and where a mechanic who cannot account for what he worked on and when is a mechanic who cannot defend himself if a question about that equipment arises later. He writes the number down in his shop notebook. He photographs the stamp with his phone. He continues the teardown. That evening, following a practice he established years earlier after a conversation with a county deputy who handled farm equipment theft cases, Curtis enters the stamp number into the National Agricultural Equipment Theft Database that law enforcement agencies and a private industry consortium maintain jointly. The database is not perfect. It does not contain every stolen piece of agricultural equipment in the country. It contains the equipment reported stolen through systems that feed into it, which is a meaningful subset of actual agricultural theft, but not a complete record. Curtis queries the number with the low expectation of a man who has done this dozens of times and found nothing significant on all but one previous occasion. The result comes back in 40 seconds. The stamp number matches a record in the database. The record is a theft report filed in October of 2013 by a Harold Briggs, county of origin, matching a county 3 states away, reporting the theft of a Massey Ferguson 375 utility tractor, serial number removed at time of theft or shortly thereafter. The record has been dormant since the initial investigation closed without a recovery in early 2014. 9 years. Sitting in the database attached to a case that nothing had connected to, waiting for exactly the kind of secondary identification that Curtis Warfield found on a Tuesday afternoon while preparing an engine block for machine work. Curtis calls the county sheriff's department listed in the theft report the following morning. The call goes to the Property Crimes Division and is handled by a detective who was not with the department in 2013 and who pulls the original file while Curtis is still on the phone. The detective's questions are professional and specific. He confirms the stamp number, confirms its location on the block, confirms the tractor's current location, and the name of the farmer who delivered it. He tells Curtis to document everything he currently has and to hold the tractor in its current state pending further contact. Curtis asks whether this is something that actually results in a recovery, or whether the complexity of a theft that has crossed 3 states and multiple ownership transfers over 9 years typically produces a different outcome. The detective is honest. He says it depends on what the chain of ownership looks like and whether the documentation at each transfer point holds up to examination. He says he will make contact with the relevant parties and be back in touch within a week. The ownership chain takes 3 weeks to trace rather than 1, because each transfer point requires contact with a different jurisdiction, and each bill of sale has to be located, verified, and assessed for what it does and does not establish about the seller's legitimate ownership at the time of each transaction. What the investigation constructs is a chain of 5 ownership transfers across 9 years and 3 states, beginning with the original theft in 2013 and ending with Dale Schammer's purchase 18 months before the engine rebuild. The first transfer, from whoever stole the tractor to the first buyer, is where investigators focus most intensively, because that is the transfer where knowledge of the theft is most likely to have existed and where criminal liability is most clearly established. The subsequent transfers present a complicated picture of who knew what at each point of sale, because each subsequent buyer received documentation that was at least partially legitimate in its appearance, assembled from the paperwork that accompanied the machine through a title washing operation that moved it from stolen property to apparently clean documentation within the first 18 months after the theft. Harold Briggs receives a phone call from the detective in late June of 2023, nearly 10 years after he stood in his shed doorway looking at the empty bay where his tractor should have been. The detective explains what has been found and where and how, walks Harold through the ownership chain as far as it has been reconstructed, and tells him that the tractor has been positively identified through the secondary engine block marking as the machine reported stolen in October of 2013. Harold is quiet for a moment after the detective finishes speaking, the silence of a man processing information he had genuinely stopped expecting to receive. Because 9 years is long enough that a theft stops feeling like an open case and starts feeling like a closed chapter. The detective's call reopens it. Harold asks what comes next. The detective explains the formal identification process, the documentation Harold will need to provide, and tells him that the question of physical recovery will depend on the legal process that follows. Harold says he understands and thanks the detective. After the call ends, he sits in his kitchen for a while thinking about a tractor he has not thought about as anything other than a closed chapter for nearly a decade. Dale Schammer, the farmer who brought the machine to Curtis's shop, is not a criminal. He is a farmer who bought a used utility tractor from a private seller, paid a reasonable price, received documentation that appeared legitimate, and operated the machine as part of his normal farming operation for a year and a half, with no knowledge that it carried a theft report from a decade earlier. He is also, under the property law of most jurisdictions, not in a position of clear legal right to keep property that was originally stolen, regardless of whether he knew about the theft at the time of purchase, because stolen property does not generally convey clean title through a chain of private sales, regardless of how many transactions intervene between the original theft and the current holder. Dale retains an attorney within a week of being contacted by investigators. Harold retains one as well, not because the theft itself is in dispute, but because recovering the physical machine after 9 years and 5 ownership transfers requires navigating a legal process that does not run itself. The attorneys spend 4 months working through the relevant statutes, the ownership documentation chain, the insurance settlement Harold received in 2014, and the question of what Harold actually stands to recover. The insurance angle complicates the straightforward narrative of Harold getting his tractor back, because the company that paid his original claim has a subrogation interest in any recovery that results from that claim, meaning that part of the value of the recovered machine belongs legally to the insurer rather than to Harold. This is not a surprise to Harold's attorney, but it is a surprise to Harold, who had not considered that the insurance settlement paid a decade earlier would create an ongoing financial interest in a machine nobody expected to ever recover. The resolution that arrives in the winter following the discovery is the kind that real legal and financial processes produce. Harold does not simply get his tractor back. The machine is assessed at current fair market value for a utility tractor of that age and condition following the completed engine rebuild, because Curtis finished the rebuild after the legal hold was lifted and the machine needed to be in operable condition for the process to move forward. The insurance company exercises its subrogation interest. Dale Schammer receives a partial reimbursement negotiated through the legal process that does not make him whole, but that acknowledges his good faith purchase position. Harold receives a cash settlement representing the portion of the recovered value that belongs to him after the insurer's interest is satisfied, which is less than the current market value of the tractor, but is real money attached to a real recovery that nobody involved in the original 2013 investigation expected to ever see. The man who stole the tractor in October of 2013 is identified through the ownership chain investigation. He is not prosecuted, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the statute of limitations on the original theft charge has run in the jurisdiction where the theft occurred. The additional charges investigators consider related to the title documents involved in the first resale present evidentiary challenges that the county prosecutor's office assesses as insufficient for a case that would require significant resources to try. This is the outcome Harold finds hardest to accept, not because he is a vindictive man, but because the clean identification of who did the theft and the legal system's inability to hold that person accountable for it are two facts that sit in direct tension with each other, and sitting with that tension is something Harold has to do without any resolution the courts can provide. Curtis Warfield receives his normal rebuild fee and a letter of recognition from the County Property Crimes Division, which he pins to the corkboard above his workbench. He tells the story of the engine block stamp to other mechanics when the topic comes up, not as a personal narrative, but as a straightforward account of why secondary identification matters and why documenting everything on every machine is worth maintaining, even when it produces nothing significant for years at a stretch. Because sometimes it produces something. And the something it produces, when it finally comes, is the thing that 9 years of a dormant theft report and 3 states of ownership documentation and 5 private sales and 1 removed serial number plate could not prevent from eventually coming to light. Harold Briggs drives past his old north shed on the way to his mailbox every morning, the same shed whose open door he saw from 200 yards away on a Monday morning in October of 2013. The shed has a new hasp and a new lock, and Harold has not forgotten to run the lock through the hasp on a single night in the 10 years since the theft. The replacement tractor is still there, still doing the secondary work the 375 used to do, still adequate in the way that adequate machines are adequate. Harold is in his early 70s now, and the farming operation has scaled back from what it was in 2013, the natural reduction that comes when a man's energy and his honest assessment of how many more full seasons he wants to manage all point in the same direction. He received the settlement check in February and deposited it and went back to the winter routine of a grain farmer between seasons. He thinks sometimes about the 375. He thinks about the 11 years he ran it before the theft, and the way a machine that always does what it is supposed to do becomes invisible in the best sense. Not noticed because it never gives you a reason to notice it, present and dependable in the quiet way of things that earn trust over time. He thinks about the Monday morning and the open shed door and the empty bay. He thinks about a mechanic 3 states away in a converted dairy barn, cleaning an engine block on a Tuesday afternoon, running his fingers over a casting surface and finding a number that had been sitting in the metal for 30 years waiting to matter. He thinks about that number and what it cost to remove the serial plate and what the plate's removal ultimately failed to accomplish, because the plate was the obvious identification. And removing the obvious identification is what a thief does. But the obvious identification was not the only identification. The only identification that cannot be removed is the one pressed into the casting before the machine ever left the factory, before anyone knew it would need to survive a theft and 9 years and 5 ownership transfers and 1 mechanic who knew where to look. A number in the metal, small enough to miss, permanent enough to matter, and patient in the way that only metal can be patient, which is to say completely and for as long as it takes.